Chapter 1. The Medieval Obsession with Doing Everything the Hard Way. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, oddly specific, and just uncomfortable enough to be interesting. So dim the lights a little, let your shoulders drop, unclench whatever part of your body medieval society would have judged you for unclenching. You don't need to learn anything important tonight. You just need to float gently through time, back to an era where people believed God cared deeply about how loudly you chewed bread. This is one of those stories you don't have to follow closely. If you drift off halfway through a king's eating schedule, that's fine. Medieval people would have considered that rude, possibly sinful, and definitely a sign of weak character. But you're safe here. Tonight, we're just observing them quietly, like mildly judgmental ghosts. Now, medieval life is often imagined as loud and chaotic, clanging armor, shouting peasants, drunken feasts, but the reality, especially among elites, was weirdly quiet, structured, rule-heavy. There were instructions for everything, not guidelines, instructions about food, about sleep, about silence itself. And naturally, most of these rules were written by people who were deeply uncomfortable with joy. Let's start with food, because medieval society was obsessed with it in a way that feels almost personal. Not just what you ate, but when, how, with whom, in what order, at what temperature, and while thinking which thoughts. Medieval medicine believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. This meant that eating was never just eating. It was medical treatment or medical sabotage, depending on your mood, your horoscope, and whether it was Tuesday. Cold foods were suspicious. Hot foods were suspicious. Raw foods were basically crimes. Fruit was especially controversial. Apples were fine sometimes. Pears were dangerous unless cooked. Cherries were chaos. If you ate the wrong fruit at the wrong time, your body might generate excess phlegm, which would make you sleepy, sinful, and possibly French. No one wanted that. Meals followed strict sequences. You didn't just sit down and eat, you progressed. Light foods first, heavy foods later, digestive aids at the end. Sugar was considered medicinal, which explains a lot about medieval desserts that were basically sugar pretending to be a vegetable. Salt mattered. Spices mattered more, not because they tasted good, but because they were hot and could balance your cold stomach. Pepper was basically therapy. Cinnamon was emotional support. And silence mattered. Oh, silence mattered a lot. At noble tables, especially in monasteries or royal courts with religious influence, talking while eating was discouraged or outright banned. Chewing was meant to be thoughtful, reflective, possibly penitential. Meals were sometimes accompanied by readings from scripture delivered by a single monk while everyone else quietly processed cabbage. Imagine being 12 years old, starving, sitting at a long wooden table listening to Leviticus while trying not to crunch too loudly on bread that could legally qualify as a weapon. Kings grew up like this. Royal children were trained early to eat calmly, slowly, and without visible enjoyment. Joy was suspicious. Enjoyment suggested indulgence. Indulgence led to sin. Sin led to hell, and hell was loud. So really, silence was preventative medicine. There were rules about posture while eating. No slouching, no leaning, no resting elbows. Elbows implied comfort. Comfort implied moral weakness. Hands were washed publicly before meals, not for hygiene, but to demonstrate purity. Dirt was normal. Moral contamination was the real concern. Napkins existed, but they were communal. One long cloth, shared down the table. You wiped your mouth where everyone else did, which somehow wasn't considered disgusting, but talking during meals was. And then there were fasting days. So many fasting days. Depending on the century, region, and religious calendar, elites could be restricted from eating meat for nearly half the year, sometimes more. No meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent, no meat during Advent, no meat on certain saints' days, no meat when Mercury was in retrograde, probably. Kings ate fish constantly, smelly fish, salted fish, fish that had traveled for weeks, fish that tasted of regret. And because digestion was such a concern, sleeping after eating was heavily regulated. Which brings us to sleep. Medieval elites did not just go to bed, they prepared for sleep like it was a religious ceremony, because it kind of was. Sleeping too much was sinful, sleeping too little was suspicious, sleeping at the wrong time was dangerous, naps were controversial. Daytime sleep could lead to excess phlegm, which again made you lazy and morally compromised. Beds were status symbols, high beds, canopied beds, beds you needed stairs to access. Beds were shared constantly, not just with spouses, but with servants, attendants, children, and sometimes random nobles who needed a place to lie down dramatically. Privacy was rare, silence was enforced. Royal bedchambers were busy places. People came and went. There were rules about when conversation was allowed. There were rules about when candles could be lit. There were rules about how you entered the room. There were rules about who got to see the king sleep, because apparently that was important. But once the king was actually in bed, noise dropped to a minimum. Talking near a superior was deeply frowned upon. Waking someone abruptly was considered physically dangerous. The soul needed time to re-enter the body, or something along those lines. People genuinely believed that sudden waking could cause madness, illness, or death.
To be fair, if you woke a medieval king abruptly, he might cause those things to you. Sleep position mattered. Sleeping on your back was risky. Sleeping on your stomach was immoral. Sleeping on your right side was ideal. Left side was for digestion, but only briefly. You were supposed to shift positions carefully, like a rotisserie chicken with opinions. And silence extended beyond the bedroom. Medieval courts had quiet hours. Monasteries had strict silence rules that spilled into secular life. Speaking unnecessarily was considered wasteful. Loud laughter was borderline sinful. Excessive conversation suggested lack of discipline. There were even rules about how loudly you were allowed to cough, which is unfortunate because medieval people coughed constantly. In some courts, hand signals were used to communicate during meals or late hours. Pointing was rude. Gesturing had rules. Looking directly at someone could be inappropriate depending on rank. Looking away could also be inappropriate. It was a delicate balance of not acknowledging anyone too much. Children were trained into this system early. Noble boys and girls learned to walk quietly, to sit quietly, to wait quietly. Emotional restraint was praised. Emotional expression was embarrassing, which explains a lot about the emotional meltdowns later. Because when you raise someone on silence, restriction, and fish-based loopholes, you do not get a well-adjusted adult. You get a king who explodes over the wrong kind of bread. And we will meet many of those. But before we drift into individual disasters, it's important to understand that medieval rules weren't just about control. They were about fear. Fear of the body, fear of desire, fear of imbalance, fear that one loud meal, one improper nap, one unregulated snack could unravel the soul. Everything had to be contained, measured, muted, even joy, and especially joy. So as we move forward, drifting gently from one royal household to another, keep that in mind. Every strange habit, every bizarre obsession with food temperature or bedtime routines, every angry outburst over silence violations, these weren't quirks, they were the logical outcome of a world that believed God was watching your dinner. Which brings us to sleep schedules. Medieval elites did not follow modern sleep patterns. They went to bed early, woke up in the middle of the night, stayed awake for an hour or two, then slept again. This second sleep was normal. During the waking period, people prayed, read, reflected, or quietly panicked about their souls. Kings did this too, but kings did it with attendants. The royal bedchamber was never empty. Someone was always nearby, someone to hold a candle, someone to listen, someone to ensure the king did not choke in his sleep, which was a genuine concern due to overeating, sinus problems, and general medieval health. Silence during these hours was mandatory. Whispering was allowed, but only when necessary. Unnecessary speech at night was believed to disturb not just sleep, but the spiritual atmosphere of the room. And some kings took this very seriously. There are records of rulers punishing servants for coughing too loudly near the bed. Sneezing was tolerated, but repeated sneezing was suspicious. Clearing one's throat too often suggested nervousness, which could imply guilt, which was unacceptable in a bedchamber full of secrets. Lights were controlled carefully. Too much light disrupted sleep. Too little light invited fear. Candles were positioned with precision. Shadows were watched closely. Night was considered a vulnerable time, when the body loosened its defenses and the mind wandered into morally questionable territory. Dreams mattered. Kings reported dreams. Interpreters analyzed them. What you ate before bed was believed to influence dreams directly. Spicy food caused lustful dreams. Cold food caused sad dreams. Cheese caused chaos. Some kings banned cheese at night entirely. Silence extended beyond the palace into broader elite culture. Monasteries were the extreme version of this, but their influence seeped into noble households. Silence was seen as discipline, as refinement, as proof of control over the body. Talking too much marked you as impulsive, emotional, unstable. These were not traits medieval society valued, unless you were writing poetry, and even then it was risky. Queens were expected to be especially quiet. Loud women were criticized relentlessly. A queen who laughed too openly could be accused of impropriety. A queen who spoke too freely could be seen as meddling. Silence was framed as virtue, obedience, grace, which made emotionally expressive queens deeply controversial. Many elite women responded to these pressures by becoming extremely pious. Others responded by developing nervous habits. Others responded by quietly hating everyone around them. Sleep deprivation played a role. Poor diet played a role. Constant observation played a role, and the ever-present rules never loosened. There were rules about when you could speak to the king, rules about where you could stand, rules about how close you could get while he ate or slept, rules about when silence was respectful and when it was insulting. Breaking silence at the wrong moment could ruin a career or end one. And yet, despite all this structure, medieval courts were full of tension, because humans are loud creatures. They sigh, they shift, they breathe, they exist. And medieval rules were fundamentally anti-existence. So what happened was predictable. People snapped. Kings who had been raised in this atmosphere often developed intense control issues. They obsessed over routines, over meals, over bedtime rituals. Any disruption felt personal. Any deviation felt threatening. A late dish, a noisy servant, a poorly timed cough, these were not minor annoyances. They were violations of a worldview that had been drilled into them since infancy. And when those kings aged, grew sickly, or lost control in other areas of life, they clung harder to these rules. Food became stricter, sleep routines became rigid, silence became enforced with increasing severity. Which brings us, slowly and gently, toward individual examples. Men who ruled empires but could not tolerate someone chewing improperly. Women who controlled kingdoms but were punished for speaking at dinner. Chapter 3. The kings who were personally offended by noise. By the time we reach individual rulers, the rules about silence stop being abstract ideas and start becoming emotional landmines. Because medieval kings did not just inherit crowns, they inherited expectations. Expectations to be calm, controlled, quiet. And when those expectations met very human irritation, the results were
intense. Let's begin with a familiar type, the king who could tolerate war, famine, and rebellion, but absolutely could not tolerate background noise. These men were often described by chroniclers as serious, contemplative, or deeply pious, which was usually code for someone who spent a lot of time glaring at people for existing too loudly. One such king was known for demanding absolute silence during meals, not symbolic silence, not polite quiet, actual silence. No talking, no laughing, no unnecessary movement. The sound of cutlery scraping a plate was enough to earn a look. A cough could ruin the evening. And this wasn't because he disliked company. It was because he believed noise disrupted digestion. And digestion, as we've established, was a moral event. He ate slowly. Everyone else ate slower. Servants moved like ghosts. Dishes were placed gently, as if the table itself might be offended. The irony is that medieval dining halls were terrible for acoustics. Stone walls, high ceilings, every sound echoed, which meant that even the smallest noise sounded larger than it was. A swallowed sip of wine could feel like a declaration.
So kings became hyper-aware, listening constantly, waiting for violations. And violations happened. Someone always dropped something. Someone always shifted. Someone always breathed wrong. And each tiny sound chipped away at the illusion of control. Punishments were rarely dramatic. No one was executed for sneezing, but careers ended quietly. A servant might be reassigned. A noble might stop receiving invitations. Silence became a social filter. Those who could comply thrived. Those who couldn't were slowly edged out. This obsession followed kings into sleep. Some rulers required absolute quiet after retiring for the night. No talking in adjacent rooms, no unnecessary movement in the corridors. Guards were instructed to patrol silently. Shoes were softened, doors were padded. And yet, medieval palaces were not quiet places. Fires crackled, floors creaked, wind moved through stone halls. Animals lived inside buildings, cats, dogs, even birds. The world did not respect royal bedtime. So kings blamed people. One ruler became convinced that his sleep troubles were caused by whispering servants. Not illness, not stress, whispering. He demanded investigations. He questioned attendance. He punished people for being awake when he was not. Which brings us to the emotional side of all this. Silence was not just about peace, it was about power. When a king enforced silence, he reminded everyone that his comfort mattered more than their existence, that their voices were privileges, that their bodies were inconveniences. This dynamic was especially visible in interactions with queens. Queens were expected to be quiet by default, but some were more expressive than others. A queen who spoke often, laughed easily, or expressed opinions could be seen as disruptive, as noisy, as morally suspect. There are queens who were criticized not for political actions, but for their voices, for speaking too much at meals, for whispering at night, for allegedly disturbing the king's rest. One queen was accused by her husband's supporters of deliberately talking late into the night to weaken him. Not plotting, talking. The implication was that her voice itself was a weapon. And sometimes kings internalized this. They associated noise with loss of control, with vulnerability, with the body betraying them. Which makes sense given medieval beliefs. Noise came from the body. Burps, coughs, laughter, all signs of excess, of imbalance, of things escaping containment. A quiet king was a virtuous king. A noisy court was a failing court. But not all rulers embraced this calmly. Some became paranoid. One particularly anxious king insisted on sleeping with multiple attendants, not for comfort, but for monitoring. He wanted to know who moved,
who breathed, who shifted position. He would wake suddenly and demand explanations. This did not improve his sleep. Servants lived in constant fear of being blamed for insomnia. If the king woke tired, someone was at fault. If he dreamed badly, someone had eaten the wrong food. If he felt ill, someone had spoken too loudly near him the day before. Which brings us back to food, because everything loops. Some kings banned certain foods entirely from the palace, not because they disliked them, but because they believed those foods made people noisy. Beans caused gas, gas caused sound, sound caused sin, so beans were out. Onions caused strong smells, strong smells were distracting, distraction led to noise. Onions were restricted. Garlic was controversial, popular, delicious, but dangerous. It lingered. It reminded the king that bodies existed, which was unacceptable. These rules often applied unevenly. The king could eat what he liked. Everyone else adapted. And then there were kings who went the opposite direction, kings who used noise strategically. Some rulers enjoyed breaking silence, clearing their throat loudly, dropping utensils, speaking suddenly after long quiet. It kept people on edge. It reminded everyone who controlled the room. These kings understood the rules deeply enough to weaponize them. Silence was the baseline. Noise was a signal. When the king spoke, it mattered, which made everyone else even quieter. Children raised in these courts learned early to regulate themselves. Princes learned to suppress laughter. Princesses learned to speak softly or not at all. Emotional expression was trained out of them, and when these children grew up, they often carried these habits with them, even when the rules no longer made sense, even when the world changed. Because medieval rules were sticky, they lodged in the mind. Chapter 4. Royal children raised like delicate furniture. Medieval royal children were not raised so much as curated. From the moment they could sit upright without falling over, they were treated as future adults who happened to be small, fragile, and extremely inconveniently loud. Childhood, as a concept, existed mostly as a problem to be managed. Noise was the first enemy. Crying babies were tolerated, but only because no one had figured out how to stop them yet. As soon as a child could be trained, they were, gently at first, then less gently. Silence was praised, stillness was rewarded, emotional expression was quietly discouraged. A well-behaved royal child was described as grave, solemn, or thoughtful, which usually meant they sat very still and did not talk unless spoken to. A lively child was willful. A loud child was undisciplined. A child who laughed too freely was concerning. Meals were training grounds. Royal children ate with adults early, sometimes as young as 5 or 6. This wasn't a privilege, it was a test. Could they sit properly? Could they chew slowly? Could they resist grabbing food? Could they remain silent while hungry? Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes publicly. A child who reached too quickly might have their hand tapped. A child who spoke out of turn might be stared into silence. A child who laughed too loudly might be removed from the table entirely. And food itself was controlled carefully. Children were not allowed to eat freely. Diets were planned to shape temperament. Too much sugar made children excitable. Too much meat made them aggressive. Too much fruit made them soft. Everything was adjusted to produce calm, obedient future rulers, which, predictably, did not work. Sleep was equally regulated. Royal children slept under supervision, not just nurses, but attendants whose job it was to monitor behavior. Nighttime was considered dangerous. Children might dream. Dreams might excite them. Excitement led to noise. Noise led to moral decay, or so the thinking went. Bedtimes were early. Beds were shared. privacy was minimal. Silence after lights out was enforced. If a child cried at night, the response depended on rank and temperament. Some were comforted, others were scolded. Crying could be interpreted as weakness, manipulation, or bad humors. And waking too early was also a problem. A child who rose before schedule might disturb others. Disturbance was a serious offense. So children learned to lie still, awake, quiet, waiting. Education reinforced these habits. Lessons were often conducted in hushed tones. Teachers emphasized listening over speaking. Asking questions was acceptable, but too many questions suggested restlessness. Restlessness suggested lack of discipline. Children memorized prayers, psalms, moral texts. Silence was built into learning. Reflection was quiet. Thinking was quiet. Even curiosity had to whisper. And then there were the rules about posture. Royal children were trained to hold their bodies in ways that minimized movement. Straight backs, controlled gestures, no fidgeting, no slouching, no unnecessary shifting. This was partly about appearance. A still body suggested control. A controlled body suggested a controlled mind. But children are not designed for stillness. So what happened was suppression. Energy had nowhere to go. Emotion had nowhere to go. Frustration simmered quietly. And when it emerged later in life, it often did so in unhealthy ways. Some children became anxious. Some became withdrawn. Some became explosive adults who had no experience regulating emotion openly. And all of them internalized the idea that being noticed was dangerous. Silence became safety. Which is why so many medieval rulers appear oddly passive in childhood accounts and oddly volatile in adulthood, because the pressure didn't stop when they grew up, it intensified. As children aged into adolescence, expectations increased. Teenage princes were expected to behave like miniature kings, teenage princesses like fully formed queens. And teenage emotions were inconvenient. A prince who sulked was weak. A princess who argued was improper. A teenager who expressed desire, anger, or boredom was disciplined. Meals remained formal. Sleep remained supervised. Silence remained the default. Some young royals responded by becoming extremely pious. Religion offered a socially acceptable outlet for intensity. Long prayers, vigils, fasting, all quiet, all controlled. Others responded by rebelling privately, whispered conversations, late-night laughter, secret snacks. These small acts of defiance were thrilling in a world of restraint. But discovery was dangerous. There are records of young nobles punished for sneaking food at night, not because they were hungry, but because eating unsupervised broke rules about digestion, timing, and moral order. A prince caught eating outside scheduled hours was not just disobedient, he was threatening cosmic balance. Sleep disruptions were also punished, staying awake too long, sleeping too late, napping at improper times, all signs of poor discipline. Children were expected to align their bodies with the rhythms of court life. Individual needs were irrelevant. And yet, despite all this, children remained children. They whispered, they giggled, they fidgeted, they cried quietly into pillows. They found ways to be human in spaces that discouraged it. Some found comfort in animals. Pets were common among royal children. Animals did not judge noise. Animals did not enforce rules. Animals did not care about posture. Others found comfort in solitude, in silence chosen rather than imposed. But even solitude was monitored. A child alone too often was concerning. Isolation suggested melancholy. Melancholy suggested black bile. Black bile suggested illness or moral weakness. There was no winning.
And so medieval royal children grew up under constant observation, constant correction, and constant quiet.
which brings us, gently, into adulthood. Because these children became the kings and queens who enforced the same rules, sometimes more harshly, sometimes with bitter precision. They knew the rules, they had lived them, and now they had the power to demand them of others. And if someone broke them, well. Chapter 5. Adults who confused routine with stability. By the time medieval royal children reached adulthood, the rules were no longer external. They lived inside them. Food schedules felt like safety. Sleep rituals felt like order. Silence felt like control. And when any of those slipped, even slightly, it felt like the world wobbling. So many adult rulers clung to routine with the intensity of someone holding on to the edge of a boat they did not trust. Daily life at court followed rigid patterns: wake at a set hour, pray, eat lightly, conduct business, eat again, walk to aid digestion, pray again, sleep, wake in the night, pray again, sleep again, repeat. Deviation was unsettling, improvisation was dangerous, and the ruler sat at the center of this rhythm like a very tired metronome. Meals remained highly controlled. Adult kings often ate the same foods repeatedly, not because they lacked options, but because familiarity was comforting. A known dish was a known outcome. A new dish introduced variables. Variables led to imbalance. Imbalance led to discomfort. Discomfort led to bad moods. Bad moods led to decisions people regretted. Some rulers restricted their diets dramatically. A king might decide that beef was too heavy, or that poultry caused agitation, or that wine should only be consumed at specific hours. These decisions were framed as health measures, but they quickly became moral rules enforced on everyone nearby. If the king avoided a food, it became suspicious. If he adopted a habit, it became expected. And silence followed these routines like a shadow. Courtiers learned quickly which rulers preferred quiet mornings, which tolerated conversation after meals, which hated chatter at night, which required near monastic silence during digestion. Courtiers adapted, they whispered, they gestured, they learned to read moods through posture and pacing. But routines were fragile. All it took was illness, stress, or age to disrupt them. And medieval rulers aged poorly. Chronic pain was common. Digestive problems were constant. Gout, in particular, made many kings miserable. Swollen joints, throbbing feet, sleepless nights. Gout was practically a royal companion. Pain disrupted sleep. Poor sleep increased irritability. Irritability made rulers stricter. Kings who slept badly became obsessed with silence. Any noise felt amplified. Any disturbance felt intentional. They suspected servants of carelessness, of disrespect, of sabotage. Food became both comfort and enemy. Eating eased pain briefly. Overeating worsened it later. So rulers oscillated: strict fasting, sudden indulgence, regret, repeat. And everyone around them suffered quietly. Queens, especially, bore the weight of this instability. A queen was expected to support the king's routines, to match his eating schedule, to follow his sleep patterns, to remain quiet when he needed quiet, to speak when he wanted distraction, to disappear when he wanted solitude. There are accounts of queens timing their movements carefully to avoid disturbing their husband's digestion, walking softly, speaking only when addressed, suppressing coughs. And when kings were ill, these expectations intensified. A sick king was considered vulnerable. Vulnerability demanded control. Control demanded stricter rules. Entire courts slowed down to match a ruler's discomfort. Meals shortened, conversations hushed, movement limited. Some rulers became so sensitive that even the presence of others felt overwhelming. They withdrew into smaller rooms, restricted access, reduced audiences. Silence expanded. This withdrawal was often framed as piety, reflection, wisdom, but it was also exhaustion. Sleep deprivation played a major role. Broken sleep cycles, pain, anxiety, fear of death, all simmering quietly. Kings who could not rest often developed rigid bedtime rituals, candles placed exactly so, doors closed in specific orders, prayers recited precisely. Any deviation caused distress. Servants learned these rituals by heart. Mistakes were punished, not always harshly, sometimes just with coldness, with exclusion, with loss of favor. And food, again, was central. A king who slept badly might blame his dinner, too heavy, too late, too rich, too noisy. Noise returned to the center of blame. A servant coughed, a dog barked, a floor creaked. These were not neutral events, they were causes. Some rulers ordered architectural changes to reduce sound, thick tapestries, extra curtains, smaller chambers, anything to muffle the world. And yet, medieval buildings were never quiet. Stone amplified sound, wind howled, fires popped, animals moved. So rulers turned inward or outward with anger. And when anger met absolute power, it became policy. Some courts developed stricter silence rules over time. No talking in corridors near royal chambers, no singing after sunset, no loud work at night. These rules affected everyone: bakers, guards, stable hands. Life adapted to royal sleep.
But the irony was constant. The more rulers tried to control their environment, the more fragile they felt. Control created dependency. Dependency created anxiety. And anxiety disrupted sleep. Which brings us to a particular pattern. Many medieval rulers who were obsessed with routine also feared change intensely. New foods, new customs, new people, all potential disruptions. Foreign visitors were unsettling. Different eating habits, different speech patterns, different noise levels. Some kings disliked banquets not because they were lavish, but because they were unpredictable. Too many people, too much movement, too much sound. So rulers avoided them or endured them rigidly, sitting stiffly, eating minimally, waiting for silence to return. These habits shaped political life. Decisions were delayed because the king was resting. Meetings were shortened because he was digesting. Audiences were canceled because he slept poorly. Entire kingdoms slowed to match one man's bodily rhythms. And yet, chroniclers often praise these rulers for their discipline, their restraint, their seriousness. Silence looked like wisdom from the outside, but inside, it was often anxiety dressed as virtue. Chapter 6: When Personal Preferences Became Sacred Law. At a certain point, a ruler's habits stopped being quirks and started being treated like truths, not opinions, not preferences, truths. And medieval courts were very good at this transformation. If a king believed something strongly enough and long enough, it hardened into custom, and then into expectation, and then into something no one remembered choosing. This is how silence became law without ever being written down. A king who disliked conversation during meals did not announce a ban. He simply frowned. He withdrew favor. He praised those who stayed quiet. Over time, the room learned. People spoke less. Eventually, people stopped speaking entirely. And when a new generation arrived, they assumed this was how things had always been. The same happened with food. A ruler who believed late dinners caused poor sleep might push meals earlier. At first, it was flexible. Then it wasn't. Kitchens adjusted. Servants adapted. Nobles reorganized their days. Eventually, eating late felt wrong, improper, almost sinful. No proclamation was needed. The body of the king had spoken. Some rulers took this process very seriously. They believed their personal discipline reflected divine favor. If they slept well, God approved. If they ate carefully, the kingdom was balanced.
If they maintained silence, order reigned. This belief made their routines feel cosmic, which meant anyone disrupting them wasn't just annoying, they were dangerous. A servant who made noise at night wasn't careless, he was threatening the king's health. The king's health was tied to the kingdom's stability. Therefore, the servant was threatening the realm. This logic escalated quickly. Punishments grew more severe, rules multiplied, silence zones expanded. What began as a preference became an obligation. And food rules followed the same path. If a king avoided certain foods, those foods vanished from court menus. Chefs adapted, markets responded, suppliers shifted. Entire regions felt the ripple effects of one man's digestion. One ruler disliked spicy food, not because of taste, but because it caused sweating. Sweating was undignified. It reminded him that bodies leaked, so spices were reduced, then removed, then frowned upon entirely. Visitors noticed, complained quietly, adapted. Another ruler believed heavy lunches caused afternoon lethargy, so midday meals became sparse. Bread, broth, maybe fruit, carefully selected. No one questioned it. No one dared. And silence wrapped around these meals like a blanket. Conversation was not banned outright, it just faded. Because speaking while the king ate lightly felt awkward. Talking while chewing broth felt excessive. Silence became the natural state. Which is how courts learned to read tiny signals. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a shift in posture. These meant more than words ever could. Courtiers became experts in quiet observation. They watched the king's hands, his breathing, the pace of his eating. They adjusted their own behavior accordingly. This constant vigilance was exhausting, and exhaustion breeds mistakes. A dropped spoon, a poorly timed comment, a laugh that escaped before it could be stopped. These moments carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they broke the illusion that everything was under control. Kings reacted differently. Some pretended not to notice, publicly calm, privately resentful. These grudges lingered quietly. Careers stalled quietly. Others reacted immediately, sharp looks, abrupt silence. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Everyone felt it. And some kings reacted unpredictably, one day forgiving, the next furious, which was the worst kind of ruler to serve. Because silence only works when it's consistent. Inconsistent silence creates anxiety, and anxiety spreads. Servants whispered more than less. Fear increased noise rather than reducing it. People moved awkwardly. Breathing became noticeable. The room filled with tension, which kings interpreted as disrespect. So rules tightened again. This cycle repeated.
Personal discomfort became ritual. Ritual became identity. Identity became law. And it didn't stop with kings. Queens adopted these habits too, sometimes willingly, sometimes strategically. Silence could be power when wielded deliberately. A queen who spoke rarely could command attention when she did. A queen who ate sparingly could signal piety. A queen who retired early could control access to the king. Some queens embraced this fully. They became models of restraint. Chroniclers praised their modesty, their quiet presence, their gentle influence. Others chafed. A queen raised in a livelier court might struggle. Different food customs, different meal lengths, different tolerance for conversation. Adjustment was expected. Failure was criticized. And silence became gendered. Men enforced it. Women embodied it, which placed enormous pressure on royal marriages. Sharing meals became tense. Sharing sleep schedules became complicated. One partner's routine dominated. And when harmony failed, silence became a weapon. Refusing to speak, eating separately, sleeping apart, these were not just personal choices, they were political signals. Courtiers watched closely. Silence was interpreted.
absence was noted, patterns were analyzed. Because in a world where noise was restricted, meaning lived in what wasn't said. And this culture extended beyond the palace. Nobles copied royal habits, lesser courts adopted similar routines. Silence trickled down the social hierarchy. Eating quietly became refined. Speaking softly became noble. Loudness became associated with lower status, which reinforced class divisions. Peasants were loud, nobles were quiet, kings silent. This stereotype persisted even when it wasn't accurate, and it shaped expectations for centuries.
Years later, chroniclers might mention that a certain noble fell from favor after an incident at table. No details, just implication. Silence was fragile like that. Sleep disruptions caused similar awkwardness. Nighttime was supposed to be quiet, but bodies do things at night. Snoring, shifting, murmuring. Sharing rooms made this unavoidable. A snoring noble was a problem, not because snoring was immoral, but because it disrupted others. Disruption was the enemy. Some people learned to sleep sitting up. Others were moved quietly to different rooms. Some were simply tolerated, grudgingly. But if the king snored, it was not discussed. If someone else snored loudly enough to wake the king, it became a serious issue. Servants tried to anticipate this. They listened. They repositioned pillows. They adjusted bedding. All in silence. Which meant mistakes happened quietly too. A servant tripping in the dark. A candle sputtering. A door creaking unexpectedly. These sounds echoed loudly in a sleeping palace. Kings woke suddenly, disoriented, unhappy. And once awake, sleep was difficult to recover. So someone was blamed. Sometimes it was fair, sometimes it wasn't. And over time, people learned to associate nighttime with fear. Fear made people tense. Tension made people clumsy. Clumsiness made noise. The cycle continued. Even food storage caused issues. Kitchens worked early, pots clanged, fires crackled, bread was baked before dawn. Efforts were made to keep kitchens far from sleeping quarters, but smells traveled, sounds traveled. Some kings complained about hearing kitchens, which led to architectural changes, thick walls, closed doors, relocated staff. Entire wings of palaces were redesigned to protect silence. And still, something always slipped through. Animals were persistent offenders. Dogs barked, cats knocked things over, horses shifted in stables. Animals did not understand hierarchy. Some rulers banned animals from certain areas. Others tolerated them as necessary noise. But tolerance was thin. A barking dog at night could be interpreted as an omen or an insult, or just incredibly annoying. And then there were guests. Foreign visitors brought different customs, louder speech, different meal habits, different expectations around conversation. Hosting them was stressful. Courts attempted to enforce local norms. Guests attempted to be polite. Misunderstandings happened. A visitor speaking enthusiastically during a meal might not realize the room was supposed to be quiet. Silence was not universal. These moments caused discomfort. The host king might interpret this as disrespect, or as cultural ignorance, or both. Diplomacy suffered quietly. And sometimes these small failures accumulated. A court that prided itself on silence became tense, unforgiving, brittle. People avoided gatherings. Meals became shorter. Social life shrank. Silence stopped being peaceful and started being oppressive. Which is when cracks appeared. Not rebellions, not revolutions, just avoidance. People ate separately, slept separately, spoke in private corners. The court fragmented quietly.
And in those spaces, away from the main halls, noise returned. Whispered conversations, soft laughter, shared complaints. Silence reigned officially, but underneath, humanity hummed. Chapter 8. When the rules outlived the reasons. By the late medieval period, many of the rules around food, sleep, and silence were still in place, but the explanations behind them had grown thin. People followed them not because they feared humors quite as intensely or believed every sound disturbed the soul, but because this was simply how things were done. Tradition had taken over. A noble might insist on quiet meals without being able to explain why. A household might serve food in a specific order without remembering the medical theory behind it. Silence persisted, even as belief softened. And this created a strange tension. People sensed that the rules mattered, but no longer knew what catastrophe they were preventing. So, enforcement became inconsistent. Some households remained strict, others relaxed. The same behavior might be acceptable in one court and scandalous in another. Guests navigated these differences cautiously. Silence became situational. A meal might begin in near quiet and gradually loosen as wine flowed. Laughter might appear late in the evening once the most formal rituals were complete. These moments felt almost transgressive, intimate, and rulers reacted differently. Some embraced the change. They enjoyed conversation. They allowed music. They tolerated noise. Others clung to old habits fiercely. The rules were familiar, comforting. Letting go felt like losing structure. These rulers were often described as old-fashioned, severe, deeply traditional. They insisted on early bedtimes, sparse meals, quiet halls, and they were increasingly out of step with the world around them.
Medical understanding was shifting slowly. Scholars questioned humor theory. New ideas circulated. But courts are conservative places. Change arrived unevenly, and silence lingered longest where power was most concentrated, which meant that royal households remained some of the quietest spaces long after others had relaxed. This caused generational friction. Younger nobles, raised with slightly looser norms, found strict courts suffocating. Older rulers found younger courtiers disrespectful. Meals became battlegrounds of expectation. A young noble might speak casually, thinking it acceptable. An older ruler might see it as shocking. Neither intended offense, both felt wronged. Sleep habits also shifted. Late-night activity became more common. Reading, writing, conversation. But in some courts, night remained sacred. A ruler who expected absolute quiet after sunset clashed with a generation accustomed to evening sociability. These conflicts were rarely explicit. They simmered. A complaint here, a disapproving glance there. Silence, ironically, became louder, and food rules grew increasingly symbolic. Eating lightly signaled restraint. Fasting signaled piety. Silence signaled seriousness. Even when no one believed these things literally, they still communicated values, which is why they persisted. But the emotional cost increased. People felt constrained by rules that no longer made sense. Ritual without belief is heavy, and so cracks widened. Some nobles began to retreat from court life entirely, preferring private estates where rules were looser. Others created informal spaces within courts, side rooms, private chambers, places where noise was tolerated. These spaces became important. They allowed laughter, conversation, humanity. And rulers who understood this often thrived. They balanced formality with release. Those who didn't became isolated. Silence, when enforced without compassion,
becomes lonely, and loneliness feeds anxiety, which fed back into stricter enforcement. This was especially visible in aging rulers. Older kings and queens, already dealing with pain and fatigue, leaned harder on familiar rules. They demanded quiet, predictability, control. Younger courtiers avoided them. Courts hollowed out. The ruler remained at the center of an increasingly empty, silent space, and chroniclers noticed. They described such courts as grave, somber, serious, rarely as joyful. Joy was not the goal, stability was, even if it meant stillness. As we move gently forward, we'll look at the quieter end of medieval life's influence, how these rules shaped architecture, daily rhythms, and even how people thought about their own bodies. Because silence doesn't just change behavior, it changes how people think. And medieval thinking, once shaped by quiet, carried that imprint far beyond the Middle Ages.
Silence stretched. Even thought patterns changed. People learned to value inwardness, reflection, restraint. Speaking became deliberate. Words weighed. Opinions filtered. This had benefits. Courts could be orderly, focused, calm. But it also stifled creativity, playfulness, emotional connection. People learned to think quietly. And quiet thinking tends to loop. Anxieties replay, doubts linger. There is no noise to interrupt them. Some medieval rulers were described as excessively introspective, prone to rumination, melancholy. This was not accidental. A life lived in silence invites the mind to fill the space, and the medieval mind was well stocked with fears. Fear of sin, fear of illness, fear of disorder. Silence amplified all of them, which is why some rulers eventually reacted against it. Late medieval courts sometimes swung in the opposite direction. Music returned, conversation loosened, banquets grew louder. Not because people rejected silence entirely, but because they needed relief. And yet, the old habits lingered. Even in lively courts, there were quiet zones, quiet hours, quiet expectations. Silence had become part of identity, and this identity traveled forward. Early modern courts inherited these patterns, modified them, justified them differently, but the core remained. Quiet signaled authority. Noise signaled chaos. Food remained regulated. Sleep remained structured. Silence remained valued. Even as medicine advanced and beliefs shifted, the rhythms persisted. Which is why so many of these medieval habits feel oddly familiar. The idea that eating too late is unhealthy, that silence aids sleep, that quiet meals are refined. These are echoes, and they are not neutral. They carry centuries of anxiety, control, and power. As we drift toward the end of this part of the story, it's worth sitting with that. Medieval rules about food, sleep, and silence were not just strange customs. They were coping mechanisms in a world that felt unstable. People clung to routine because routine felt safe. They enforced silence because noise reminded them how little they controlled. And kings, at the center of it all, lived in carefully constructed quiet that rarely brought peace, just order. In the next stretch of our slow journey, we'll gently compare these habits to other cultures and later periods, not to judge them, just to notice the differences. Because sometimes understanding the past means listening carefully to what it tried very hard not to say. Chapter 10. Quiet Habits Across Cultures and Time. As we float gently forward, It's interesting to notice that the medieval obsession with food, sleep, and silence was not universal, even in the same era. Other cultures approached these matters differently, though always with their own underlying sense of control and moral reasoning. Observing them helps us see how unusual and sometimes extreme European elite habits were. In some Mediterranean courts, for example, meals were long, social affairs. Food was abundant, conversation was encouraged, laughter was a sign of health, not moral failing. Noise was tolerated, even expected. Yet these societies had their own rules. Dining etiquette existed. People could not just shout across a hall or eat with their hands in public. But the emphasis on strict silence was far less pronounced. The body could express itself more freely. Moving eastward, some Asian dynasties had highly ritualized meals too, but silence was often balanced with performance and music. Eating became a demonstration of refinement, but also artful expression. The Japanese imperial court incorporated ceremony, pacing, and careful gestures, yet allowed subtle interaction. Silence was respected, but fluid, not rigid. Here, food and behavior were measured, but not morally fraught in the way medieval Europe insisted. Even within Europe, there were contrasts. Italian city-states encouraged lively debate during meals. Venetian patricians might argue politics over several courses. Noise was not just tolerated, it was a sign that minds were engaged. The underlying fear that sound could disrupt humors or morality was largely absent. So what we see is a spectrum. The more hierarchical and isolationist a court, the stricter its silence. The more cosmopolitan and interactive, the more tolerant of noise.
Sleep, too, varied widely. In northern climates, long winters shaped nocturnal habits differently. People often adapted to the darkness with multiple sleeping periods, not because of moral rules, but because it made practical sense. In parts of Asia, segmented sleep existed, but was often accompanied by quiet meditation or reflection rather than strict moralized silence. Again, function mingled with ritual, but without the obsessive enforcement seen in late medieval European courts. Food restrictions also reflected geography and ideology. Monastic fasting, which heavily influenced European court life, emphasized abstinence not just for health, but for spiritual discipline. In other cultures, fasting existed, but was not always tied to controlling behavior or silence. It might mark piety, yes, but rarely imposed the same social pressure on others nearby. And yet there was always structure. Meals were scheduled, portions monitored, etiquette observed. Control was universal, rigidity was variable. It's also worth noticing the psychological consequences across cultures. Wherever silence and strict control were enforced, people learned to monitor themselves. They became attuned to the subtle cues of authority, trained to anticipate expectations. And when those expectations were internalized, they often shaped personality. Quiet, careful, self-restrained individuals tended to emerge. Conversely, societies that tolerated noise and movement produced individuals more relaxed about expression, though still bound by other rules. In other words, human behavior adapts to rules, whether they are strict or flexible. Silence, when mandated, does more than regulate sound. It shapes thought. It directs attention inward. It teaches restraint. And it subtly encourages anxiety, because the consequences of failure, however minor, are magnified by social scrutiny. By the late medieval period, the European courts had evolved this into an almost artful obsession. Silence was layered over food rituals, sleep schedules, and social hierarchy. It was embedded in architecture, daily routines, and the bodies themselves. Courtiers learned to live within these constraints, adjusting every movement and breath to an invisible standard. Yet, across cultures, we see that humans always negotiate these constraints in private. A suppressed giggle, a hidden snack, a whispered conversation in a hallway.
Small rebellions, almost imperceptible, remind us that rules, no matter how strict, meet the reality of human imperfection. And in the quietest European courts, this tension was constant. Rules demanded stillness, human bodies resisted it, emotions pressed against it, noise slipped through despite centuries of careful conditioning. And in those small breaches, we glimpse the human cost of discipline. Which is why the medieval obsession with food, sleep, and silence is so fascinating. It was practical, it was moral, it was psychological, but above all, it was human. People followed these rules not out of cruelty, but because they believed it would maintain health, virtue, and order. And when that failed, they tried harder, with more ritual, more silence, more vigilance. And that brings us to the next gentle stage of our journey, how these rules influenced the emotional lives of rulers themselves, how strict routines could shape fear, melancholy, and a very particular kind of quiet despair. By the time we reach the personal, emotional impact of these rules, it becomes clear that silence and strict routines did more than organize a court. They molded the minds of rulers. Medieval kings and queens were not just governed by advisors or laws, they were governed by the internalized rhythms of food, sleep, and silence that had been drilled into them from infancy. And those rhythms carried subtle, long-lasting consequences. Rulers who grew up eating slowly, speaking minimally, and sleeping under close supervision learned early that comfort was contingent. Every sound, movement, or bite had meaning. Obedience was survival. In such a framework, anxiety could become chronic because the rules never fully relaxed. A king might rise each day anticipating disruption, not rest. He had learned as a child that even small noises could signal danger, disrespect, illness, or disorder. The body remained on alert long after childhood, attuned to every creak of the floor, every cough from an attendant, every shuffle of feet nearby. Sleep, which should be restorative, became tense. Nap times, once imposed, evolved into rituals meant to preserve control. But control is exhausting when maintained constantly. Meal habits had similar effects. When meals were highly regimented, what to eat, when, how much, in what order, rulers learned to evaluate their own bodies obsessively. Digestion became moralized. Overeating or eating out of schedule was not just discomfort, it was failure. Such focus created meticulous individuals, yes, but also prone to stress and obsessive self-monitoring. Silence amplified these tendencies. In quiet courts, even minor mistakes resonated. The lack of external distraction allowed internal anxieties to echo. A dropped spoon, a whisper too loud, a cough, all became symbolic. And over decades, rulers internalized the monitoring. They learned to judge themselves as harshly as they judged others. Every misstep felt amplified. This psychological conditioning manifested in complex ways. Some rulers became highly introspective, pious, and deliberate. Their restraint could be admirable. Decision-making was cautious, thought through, measured. They maintained order and projected gravitas. The chroniclers praised them as wise, serious, disciplined. Others, however, internalized the anxiety more negatively. They became irritable, suspicious, or melancholy. They interpreted minor disruptions as affronts. They developed hypersensitivity to noise or disorder. A servant breathing too loudly might provoke genuine distress. Dining with guests could be stressful, not social. Sleep was never entirely safe. Each day demanded vigilance. Marriage amplified these pressures. Queens often had to navigate the strict routines of their husbands while maintaining their own households, balancing expectations of silence, timing, and etiquette. A queen's ability to manage these rules could determine her influence, her favor, and sometimes her survival. Conversely, rulers who internalized the same pressures could interpret any deviation as insult or threat, straining domestic relationships. Children of such rulers inherited subtler pressures.
Even if raised more leniently, they observed parental anxiety, meticulous habits, and overvaluation of silence. They learned that sound, movement, or appetite were morally or socially charged. These lessons carried forward, perpetuating the cycle. The cumulative effect on rulers was profound. Some became rigid, almost machine-like in habit. Others oscillated between extreme caution and sudden emotional reactions when control slipped. Fear, anticipation, and vigilance became companions. Tranquility was never complete because the body remembered the discipline of childhood and court. Yet there were quiet rewards. Order brought clarity. Ritual created predictability. Within highly regimented lives, some rulers experienced genuine calm. Meals became meditative. Prayer offered reflection. Silence provided a kind of sanctuary, brief, fragile, but deeply cherished.
Still, even in these moments, humans are imperfect. Accidents happened. Visitors spoke too loudly. Children misbehaved. Animals made noise. Weather disrupted sleep. And each breach, however minor, was magnified by expectation. The result was a psychological landscape uniquely shaped by medieval routine, constant self-monitoring, subtle anxiety, occasional melancholy, but also discipline, deliberation, and keen awareness of the social environment. This is the invisible legacy of medieval rules about food, sleep, and silence. They were not merely customs, they were tools of mental conditioning. They molded rulers' attention, emotional responses, and the very architecture of daily thought. As we drift into the next chapter, we will explore specific examples, kings and queens whose daily lives reflected these pressures, whose personalities were unmistakably sculpted by centuries of inherited expectations, and whose private moments reveal how silence and routine shaped not just the court, but the self itself. Chapter 12: Kings and Queens Shaped by Routine. Let's float gently over a few examples of rulers whose lives were unmistakably molded by the intersection of strict routines, silence, and highly controlled habits. These aren't dramatic sagas of conquest or battle. They are slow, almost mundane glimpses of personality shaped by centuries of expectation, yet deeply human in their peculiarities. Take, for instance, a certain northern king, known among chroniclers as meticulous almost to the point of obsession. Every meal was timed precisely. He awoke at the same hour daily, even during winter when sunrise came late. Guards, servants, and courtiers alike learned to move like shadows, speak in soft tones, and anticipate his every need. Deviations from this rhythm were quietly noted, and while no one was executed for tardiness or small mistakes, favor shifted silently, subtly over time. He was not cruel, just acutely attuned to noise and disruption, and lived in a constant low-level tension. Sleep for him was rarely restorative. Quiet halls helped, but never fully erased the vigilance instilled since childhood. Contrast that with a queen from the same period, raised in a slightly more expressive household. She had been taught to observe silence, but also to read emotional nuance, to use her voice sparingly but powerfully. She could signal approval with a tilt of her head or a carefully chosen phrase. In her household, meals were still quiet, but laughter sometimes slipped in late at night when her husband slept. She was aware that silence carried authority, yet she wielded it as a tool rather than a constraint. Her skill lay in blending the rigidity of expectation with subtle human flexibility. She understood the value of rhythm, but she also understood the importance of occasional gentle disruption. Then there are rulers whose early childhoods had been even more regimented. Some princes and princesses grew up with rules so strict that every bodily function was observed and interpreted. Digestion, sleep patterns, and even subtle expressions of discomfort were cataloged. These children matured into adults who appeared austere, almost machine-like in behavior.
Yet inside, there was often a rich, anxious awareness. They could be sensitive to every whisper, every creak, every hint of disorder, an acute perceptiveness born from necessity. Humor, spontaneity, and excess became risky behaviors, and so they learned to repress them. Private rebellion existed in the margins, secret walks, whispered conversations, or indulgent foods eaten discreetly. These were small, quiet ways of asserting autonomy within highly structured lives. Interestingly, some rulers internalized the lessons so thoroughly that they applied them universally. A king who had been raised in near total quiet might extend similar expectations to the entire court. Silence became a form of governance. Meals were ceremonial. Speech was regulated. Sleep schedules became enforced policy rather than personal habit. And yet, these rulers could be gentle within the framework, favoring those who adapted gracefully and quietly, subtly rewarding those who understood the unspoken rules. Others resisted internally. The contrast between expectation and desire sometimes produced melancholy or irritability. A ruler might follow the rules perfectly in public, yet privately chafe against them. Nighttime could become a space of tension, the fear of disrupted sleep, the inability to fully relax, or simply the memory of decades of enforced quiet pressing inward. These rulers often had private routines, extended prayers, secret readings, or walks alone, which allowed them to navigate the tension between obligation and human need. And so, over time, the personality of a medieval ruler became inseparable from these habits. Silence was not merely external, it became internalized. Eating slowly, sleeping on a precise schedule, and moving cautiously through the world shaped emotional and cognitive life. Decision-making reflected careful deliberation, but also heightened anxiety. Interactions with others were filtered through decades of subtle conditioning. Humor and spontaneity, when they appeared, were tempered by caution. These were rulers whose minds had been trained for centuries of quiet observation, reflection, and restrained action. Even seemingly small events, a cough at table, a creaking floorboard, a misaligned meal, could resonate far beyond their immediate moment, touching the very architecture of thought and perception. And in that resonance, the influence of routine, silence, and controlled habits becomes clear. The court was not merely a space of power, it was a space that sculpted the mind, habitually, slowly, and inexorably. In the next chapter, we will explore how these patterns affected not just personality, but governance itself, how the mundane rules of food, sleep, and silence subtly, almost invisibly influenced governance itself. Rulers who had spent decades internalizing these rules carried their expectations into every corner of political life. Take decision-making. A king trained to eat slowly and speak rarely was unlikely to rush judgments. Every choice was measured, deliberate, and cautious. Courtiers learned to present options carefully in structured formats, anticipating not just content, but tone, timing, and subtle cues. A misstatement, a poorly timed gesture, a hastily delivered report could be noticed and perhaps quietly penalized. The machinery of government moved in rhythm with the ruler's internal clock.
Audiences, too, were shaped by these habits. Meetings were often brief, silent, and orderly. Disruption was subtly discouraged. Noise, chatter, or sudden displays of emotion were interpreted as disrespect or incompetence. The quieter the audience, the more smoothly the ruler could operate. And because silence had been ingrained from childhood, the king or queen could process complex matters efficiently, but also became unusually sensitive to disturbance. Even minor interruptions could unsettle the flow of governance. Diplomacy followed similar patterns. Ambassadors and envoys quickly learned the importance of timing and tone. They observed meal schedules, room arrangements, and periods of quiet,
as carefully as the words they spoke. The success of negotiations often depended on understanding these subtle cues, a sigh, a pause, a measured gesture, and silence itself became a tool of strategy. Speaking too early, too loudly, or too casually could be seen as arrogance or disrespect. Conversely, well-timed quiet could convey deference, intelligence, or alignment with the court's rhythm. Routine also shaped lawmaking and policy. A ruler who relied on daily rhythms for stability often expected the same from their officials: meetings scheduled at predictable times, reports delivered at precise intervals, punishments and rewards meted according to clear, repeatable procedures. This created efficiency, but also rigidity. Emergencies that demanded improvisation could become stressful or even threatening. The court, trained in quiet observation and adherence to routine, might struggle to adapt quickly. And of course, the ruler's personal anxieties infiltrated governance. Sensitivity to disruption could translate into heightened attention to disorder, rebellion, or potential offense. Noise, literal or metaphorical, was interpreted as risk. A delayed report might indicate inefficiency. A disagreement among advisors might signal disloyalty. This tendency to overread small disturbances often shaped the way power was exercised, quietly but significantly. Even ceremonial life reflected these patterns. Processions, banquets, and court rituals followed strict schedules. Silence was built into every action, from the measured steps of guards to the timing of announcements. Public displays of emotion were carefully controlled. Courtiers learned that appearances mattered as much as, if not more than, words. And behind the decorum, the psychological impact of routine and silence remained constant. All behavior was observed, interpreted, and responded to.